I'm 66 years old now, and there are mornings when the cold seems to rise straight out of the floorboards and settle into my bones like regret. I sit by the stove and watch the embers pulse red and gold, and I think about the life I live among the Oregon timber camps. Fog-soaked dawns, the sting of resin on open knuckles, the constant ache of a man who spent more years among trees than people. I used to believe the forest was just a workplace, a place to earn a wage and grow old too fast. But age has a way of peeling back illusions. Sometimes the silence outside my cabin feels like a waiting presence, and I know exactly what memory is pressing against my thoughts. It always begins with the fall of '74, when the world felt narrow and heavy after my brother died in a mill accident, leaving me hollowed out and reckless with grief. I took the deepest contract I could find, miles from the nearest road, because distance felt like the only medicine. But the forest had plans for me. Strange, unsettling plans I couldn't have understood back then, not even if someone had warned me. That first month on the ridge, I kept my head down and my ears open, letting the work numb whatever still throbbed inside me. The forest in that part of the Three Sisters wilderness felt older than anything I had known. Towering firs holding up a ceiling of pale autumn light, moss thick as velvet underfoot, and a silence that pressed itself into my breathing. But something about that silence was wrong. Animals avoided our camp. No deer trails, no bear tracks, not even the scattered chatter of squirrels in the branches above. It was as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't yet see. I tried to ignore it, blaming the strange tension on weather or exhaustion, but unease grew roots in me. At night, I'd sit outside the bunkhouse after the other men fell asleep, the cold air burning in my lungs, and I would swear I heard faint movement beyond the tree-line. Heavy footfalls, too deliberate to be wind, too slow to be human. I told myself it was nothing, the mind playing tricks on a lonely man. But every night the footsteps crept a little closer, and every morning the ground looked different. The breaking point came one stormy evening when the sky darkened faster than seemed natural, and the wind climbed through the trees like a living thing. I had stayed behind after the others retreated to camp, tying down loose equipment before the rain swallowed the ridge. The air tasted metallic, like lightning waiting to strike, and the forest floor trembled underfoot as gusts bent the firs until their trunks groaned. I was reaching for a coil of rope when I sensed movement behind me. Quiet, deliberate, massive. I froze, breath halted in my throat. Through the sheets of rain, a shape unfolded from the tree-line. Not a bear, not any beast I'd learned to fear. It rose upright, taller than any man I'd met, shoulders broad as a cabin door, for dripping with rain. But it was the eyes that undid me. Dark, intelligent, watching with caution rather than hunger. For one suspended moment, the storm seemed to muffle itself, as though the forest were listening to our silence. Then another shape appeared beside the first, smaller but no less imposing, and I understood with a kind of awe that I had stumbled upon a pair. Two beings bound together at last. For reasons I still can't explain, I didn't run. Fear should have driven me back toward camp. But something steadier held me in place, a fragile recognition, a sense that these beings were as startled by me as I was by them. The larger one stepped slightly forward, not threateningly, but with protective tilt of the shoulders that told me the smaller figure mattered deeply. Rain coursed down their bodies in shining rivulets, and their breaths rose in soft clouds that mingled with the storm. I lifted my hands slowly, palms open, hoping the gesture carried across whatever gulf lay between our worlds. Neither moved for several heartbeats. Then the smaller one let out a sound, low, trembling, strangely melodic. It wasn't speech, not in any human sense, but the emotion in it was unmistakable. Anxiety laced with curiosity. The larger one answered with a deeper tone, as if offering comfort. I felt like an intruder witnessing something intimate. Lightning cracked above us, and a tree split somewhere in the darkness, but none of us flinched. In that suspended moment, the forest felt less like a place and more like a threshold. I sensed our lives were now quietly intertwined forever. Then a thunderous crack shattered the moment, followed by the groan of a falling trunk. The tree came down so close that the ground lurched beneath us. The two beings reacted instantly. The larger one pulled the smaller behind a jet of rock, shielding it with a practiced, almost parental instinct. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, but the larger one's eyes never left mine, as if checking whether I had survived as well. In that tiny, fragile exchange, I felt something shift, an unspoken acknowledgement, a thread of shared danger weaving us together. The storm howled on, tearing through branches and blurring the world into streaks of silver and shadow. When I blinked the rain from my eyes, the pair had begun retreating into the trees, moving with a quiet urgency that suggested they had lingered too long. I want to call out, to ask them what they were, but the words tangled uselessly in my throat. They paused once at the edge of the clearing, silhouettes flickering like myths in the lightning. And though I couldn't hear their voices of the storm, I felt the moment settle into my bones like fate. A beginning. I didn't know what that beginning meant. The weeks after that storm passed in a strange quiet that unsettled me more than the encounter itself. I kept expecting the pair to reappear, or for some trace of them to vanish, as though I had imagined the whole thing. But small signs began slipping into my days, subtle, careful, almost courteous. A stone placed on my chopped firewood with purposeful precision. Pine cones stacked in an unlikely tower near the cabin door. Once, a salmon left on a stump, its silver skin still glistening with river water. Nothing was taken in return, nothing disturbed, just offerings or messages, or perhaps reminders that I'd been seen. I tried telling myself it was coincidence, or some prank by one of the few men still lingering in the area, but my gut knew better. The forest felt watchful in a new way, gentler but keener, as though an invisible thread linked my steps to someone else's breathing. As winter deepened, the logging crew thinned until only a few of us remained. Work slowed, shifts shortened, and the long nights stretched like dark rivers around camp. I often sat outside at dusk, boots halfway unlaced, feeling the bite of cold settle around my ankles. I found myself listening for the rhythm of heavy footfalls I'd heard that night, a rhythm so unlike human gait that it lingered like a drumbeat from a forgotten ceremony. The loneliness that had once numbed me after my brother's death now felt lighter, even oddly expectant, as though the forest itself was inviting me to step closer, not physically, but emotionally, into a space I had never known existed. There were moments when I could swear I sensed their nearness, a shift in the air, the faintest warmth against the wind, a hush that wasn't fear but patience. They were waiting for something. By early spring, snowmelt carved silver lines through the underbrush, and the world awakened with scents of moss, thawing earth and rain. One morning, on a walk along the creek, I found a track pressed into mud, a print wider than my boot, deeper than any man could make. Its angle suggested the maker had stood there watching my cabin. That print changed something in me. Until then, I had received signs without responding. Now it felt wrong not to answer. I began leaving small tokens on a fallen cedar by the creek. Apples, a strip of venison, a polished stone I kept for luck. Each time I returned, the items were gone, and the cedar branches arranged differently, almost thoughtfully, as though someone were acknowledging the gesture. The first sound came on a night, when the air felt too still. I had just stirred the fire when a low hum drifted through the trees, long, rising, almost musical. It vibrated through my ribs, settling deep in the spaces grief had carved out. Another voice answered, softer, higher, trembling with emotion. I knew instantly it was them, speaking in a tongue older than pine bark or river stones. I stepped outside, holding my breath, the cold burn in my throat as I searched for shapes in the dark. I didn't see them, but their voices brushed against the night like silk ribbons, and something in me softened, loosened, opened. It felt like being trusted from a distance. Weeks later, I returned to the ridge where we had first met. Sunlight filtered through the trees in soft gold shafts, and warmer steamed as the morning thaw rose. I placed smoked fish on the mossy stump near the clearing, half expecting nothing, half hoping the forest would answer. When branches rustled behind me, I froze. The female stepped out first, her movements fluid and quiet, her eyes glowing with gentle intelligence. She was close enough for me to see the way light wove through her fur like threads of copper. She studied me with a mixture of caution and recognition, tilting her head as though comparing this version of me to memories she carried. I lowered my gaze, not wanting to challenge or crowd her, letting my hands rest open at my sides. A deeper rustle came next, the male emerged with a weight that seemed to anchor the air. Up close, He looked older than I remembered, with scars across his forearm and a stiffness that suggested recent struggle. His gaze lingered not on the food, but on me, reading my posture the way one might read the wind. Fear flickered through me but was swallowed by calm. The forest held its breath. The female moved first, stepping to the stump, examining the offering with long, deliberate fingers. She lifted the fish and turned toward me, exhaling a warm breath, carrying the scent of river water and cedar. Then she made a sound, a soft, almost tender hum meant for me alone. My chest tightened unexpectedly. I hadn't heard a voice speak with that kind of gentleness since before my brother passed. The male watched the exchange, shoulders loosening slightly, as though some part of him had been waiting to see what I would do. I didn't dare move closer. Instead, I nodded, a small gesture that felt monumental. The female responded by touching her chest, then lowering her hand to the ground between us. A simple gesture, but unmistakably communicative. An invitation, a bridge. When they retreated moments later, disappearing into the forest-shadowed labyrinth, the clearing felt heavier with meaning than any place I'd known. I stood there long after they left, listening to the last echo of their presence flicker through the branches. I should have felt triumphant or afraid. Instead, I felt watched again, but this time not by them. As I walked back toward the cabin, a shiver crawled up my spine. Fresh tire tracks cut through mud behind my home, the soil still wet from their weight. Whoever had driven that close hadn't bothered to hide. The tracks circled the cabin once, paused near my firewood, then veered toward the old service road. Someone was searching for something in those woods. In that moment, I knew the bond one was building was no longer mine to protect. Danger had already found its way in. I should have walked away the moment I saw those tire tracks, but some instincts buried themselves too deep to ignore. In the days that followed, the forest felt wrong in ways I couldn't easily name. The air carried a tension that didn't belong to weather or wildlife, and the paths I'd walked 1,000 times seemed to shift under my boots, warning me back toward camp. I noticed cigarette butts near the creek. Fresh ones, the paper still dry despite the morning frost. I saw branches snap chest-high, not by storms, not by elk, but by men forcing their way through brush with purpose. I tried to shake the dread gathering inside me, but it clung to my ribs like a cold hand. The forest wasn't just being watched. It was being probed. One evening, I found a strip of red survey tape tied around a fir trunk near the ridge. I'd spent my life in logging. I knew the language of tape. Yellow for caution, blue for boundaries, pink for mapping. Red meant target. Red meant removal. And this was nowhere near a lumber route. The knot was military tight, the kind used by men who never wanted their work misread. My pulse hammered. Someone else had been on that ridge, and they had noticed what I had been too afraid to tell anyone. It was near sunset when I heard rustling deeper in the underbrush, heavier than deer, more cautious than bear. I braced myself, expecting the male or female to emerge, but instead the forest settled into a strange hush, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Minutes passed before a soft, trembling sound reached me, a whimper, high and frightened. I moved slowly toward it, each step sinking into damp soil. When I parted a curtain of ferns, I saw a small shape crouched behind a fallen log. At first I thought it was a child, maybe lost from a camping party. But then it lifted its head, and my breath caught in my throat. The creature was half the size of the female, with softer features and lighter fur, its eyes huge and glossy with fear. A juvenile, a child. Its tiny hands clutched the moss as though the ground itself might give way if it let go. When our eyes met, it froze, trembling, then tilted its head the same way the female had done on that ridge, studying me, searching for danger. I knelt slowly, hands open. A gentle sound escaped it, a call for comfort or a plea. My chest tightened. I had no children of my own. Life had never given me that chance. But something about that small being stirred a place inside me I thought had withered years ago. A deep, ragged exhale sounded behind me, and I turned to see the male leaning against a cedar trunk, his massive frame sagging. Blood darkened the fur along his ribs. Not a small wound, a rifle shot, the kind that tears through flesh with merciless precision. He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw pain in his eyes, not the primal pain of injury, but the hollow grief of a guardian who has failed the ones he vowed to protect. Instinct overrode fear. I slid closer, pressing a cloth against the wound, whispering apologies as though they held any healing at all. His breathing rattled, each inhale a battle. The juvenile whimpered again, edging closer until it pressed its small body against the female, who emerged moments later, panting, scratched, frantic. She knelt beside the male, her hands trembling as she touched his face, humming a sound that vibrated through the clearing. A cry, a plea, a prayer. I felt like an intruder in sacred grief, yet the male reached out weakly and placed his heavy hand on my shoulder. The weight of it nearly brought me to tears. In that moment, I knew he understood I meant no harm. Perhaps he even recognized the loneliness that clung to me. His gaze shifted toward the juvenile, then toward the trees, where distant snapping branches signaled movement. Man, clothes, hunting. The female's posture changed instantly. She rose, placing herself between the juvenile and whatever approached. Her eyes burned with protective fury. But she looked at me once, and I could swear there was a question in her gaze, a desperate request I wasn't sure I was strong enough to answer. Then, with a final breath that shuddered through his enormous chest, the male's hand slipped from my shoulder and fell to the forest floor. His eyes dimmed like fading embers. The female let out a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a wail that tore through the trees, raw and ancient. Birds scattered from branches. Even the wind seemed to recoil. And that scream brought the hunters straight to us. Red flashlight beams swept through the shadows. Voices barked orders. The female pulled the juvenile close, her entire body shaking but determined. I stood up, turning toward the lights, heart pounding, hands trembling around the handle of my old axe. I had never stood between a weapon and a life before. But grief does strange things to men. It can hollow you, or it can harden you. Tonight, it hardened me. When the first silhouette stepped into the clearing, rifle raised, I positioned myself between him and the creatures. My voice cracked as I shouted for him to stop. He hesitated, thrown off by the sight of a logger standing guard over something no man was supposed to see. More men arrived behind him, their faces unreadable beneath the red glow of their lights. "Sir, step aside," one ordered, his tone flat, rehearsed. "That animal is dangerous." I didn't move. The forest seemed to hold attention like a drawn bow, branches barely daring to sway. The female touched my back lightly, a gesture so gentle it nearly broke me. I knew she was ready to sacrifice herself if it meant saving her child. I also knew she wouldn't survive a single bullet. So I lifted my axe, not to swing, not to fight, but to make my meaning clear. The nearest hunter muttered something into his radio. A decision was forming behind his eyes, something cold and crushing. I could feel it gathering weight. And just as he adjusted his grip on the rifle, preparing to aim past me, a low rustle sounded from the darkness, soft, cautious, deliberate. Something else was watching us. Something I had not yet seen. Something that would change everything. I didn't turn toward the sound at first. My instincts told me any sudden movement would set the rifles twitching in the hunter's hands. And if they fired now, they wouldn't stop at me. The female pressed the juvenile closer, her breath ragged, her body trembling with the impossible effort of shielding a life far more fragile than her own. The men kept their lights fixed on her towering silhouette, but their fingers were tightening, inch by inch, curling with the kind of certainty that comes from orders handed down by people who never walk into forests themselves. The rustle came again, a slow shift of weight, a thoughtful step, almost an announcement. When the shape emerged between two fir trunks, the hunters jerked their rifles upward, beams scattering across moss and bark. I expected another adult, another towering figure come to avenge the fallen male. But what stepped into the clearing wasn't rage incarnate. It was elderly, massive, yes, but stooped by age, fur streaked with gray, movements deliberate. Its eyes held the heaviness of someone who had seen too much loss to waste another moment on fear. The female's posture changed instantly. She dipped her head the way grieving families acknowledge elders in a final hour. The juvenile whimpered with recognition and clung tighter. The old one regarded me briefly, and in that briefness lay a strange acceptance, as if it already knew who I was, and what part one was meant to play in this moment. Then it turned toward the hunters. No sound left its throat. It simply stepped forward until the red lights painted its chest in trembling circles. One of the men whispered a curse. Another took a half step back. Their training had prepared them for a monster, not for a being that stood in front of guns with the dignity of an elder walking his final mile. Everything about the old one spoke of endings, of memory, of lineage, of a world too ancient to kneel before human fear. The nearest hunter adjusted his stance, and the old one answered by lifting a hand, not high, but just enough to show he understood the language of threat. The gesture wasn't aggressive. It was sorrowful, almost tired, like someone telling a child to lower their voice at a funeral. Something inside me cracked. I found myself stepping closer to the hunters, lowering my axe from threat to plea. I told them to stop. My voice didn't carry power, only truth. But sometimes truth unsettles men more than warning shots. The hunter closest to me barked for silence, but there was a tremor in his tone that hadn't been there before. The old one didn't wait for permission. He walked with slow, heavy steps toward the fallen male, the needles beneath him muffling each footfall as though the forest itself wanted to soften his path. When he reached the body, he knelt with such aching reverence that the female let out a low, grieving sound. He touched the male's face, then pressed his own forehead gently to the still chest. The hunters watched, guns wavering. They weren't witnessing an animal ritual. They were witnessing farewell, a goodbye shaped in an ancient language of touch and breath and silence. When the old one finally rose, something changed in the clearing. Leaves fluttered though the wind had died. The air thickened, charged with a feeling that reminded me of standing at the edge of a cliff. The old one shifted slightly, positioning himself between the hunters and the family with the certainty of someone making a final choice. The female understood instantly. She lifted the juvenile, cradling it against her chest, and prepared to run. But she didn't move yet, not until the old one looked at her, a look filled with old pain, old love, old instruction, the kind given in the last heartbeat before sacrifice. The hunters sensed movement coming, and in their panic they raised their rifles again, voices snapping into commands. I stepped between them one last time, shouting words I couldn't remember later, words torn from a part of me that refused to let this end in slaughter. The hunters hesitated just long enough. The old one took a single thunderous step forward, slapping his hand against a cedar trunk with force that split the bark. The sound cracked like a gunshot through the clearing. The female lunged at that exact moment, disappearing into the darkness with the juvenile pressed against her, her powerful strides carrying her deeper than any human could follow. Shouts erupted. Red beams jerked wildly. A single rifle fired, the bullet striking dirt near the old one's feet. He didn't react, not with fear, not with pain. He simply stood tall, or as tall as his age allowed, and let out a bellowing roar that vibrated through the ground, a sound not meant to intimidate but to command. The hunters stumbled back, shaken not by volume but by something older than sound, a resonance that came from the bones of the earth itself. As the female's footsteps faded into forest, the old one lowered his head. The roar had taken something out of him. His chest heaved in slow, labored breaths, and he staggered once, catching himself on the cedar he had struck. I felt the truth before I understood it. He had stood his last stand. His purpose had ended the moment the juvenile vanished into safety. The hunters didn't fire again. They were frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing death or surrender. The old one turned his gaze toward me for one final second, and in that second I saw gratitude wrapped in exhaustion. He slumped slowly, collapsing to his knees, then to his side, the forest receiving him with the quiet reverence one gives to returning kings. No one spoke. Even the hunters lowered their rifles, swallowed by a silence too profound for orders. I walked to the old one, kneeling beside him, my hands trembling as I touched his fur, warm still, but fading. I whispered something I don't remember now, something foolish and human, and small compared to what he had given. His final breath left him like a sigh carried through ancient branches. When I lifted my head, the forest felt emptier than I'd ever known it. But in that emptiness was a pulse, a truth I couldn't unhear. Something had been handed to me, not a burden, a legacy. And though the hunters ordered me away, threatened me with silence, I knew the truth had rooted itself in me like a seed waiting for its season. And that night, as I lay awake, I felt eyes watching from far within the timberline. Not hostile, not afraid. Waiting. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.